Welcome back. We're finishing this run with the stuff people actually argue about at dinner. Sleep, alcohol, screens, and whether your brain is basically getting bullied by modern life. And yeah, it gets a little uncomfortable, which is usually how you know it matters. The sleep piece first, because that felt like the least glamorous and most brutal one. He's saying the brain's cleaning system mostly opens when you're asleep, which means all that I can run on 4 hours ego is just dirty brain cosplay. That line should annoy a lot of people, including younger me. Same, because everybody loves pretending exhaustion is some sort of identity. But the sleep apnea thing was wild to me. Like, if you stop breathing at night and never treat it, you're basically starving the brain of oxygen. And people just shrug at the mask because it looks annoying. Right, because the alternative is apparently speed-running brain damage. What I liked is he kept tying sleep back to everything else, not just memory. Blood flow, inflammation, toxic buildup, all of it gets worse when sleep falls apart. That's not motivational poster advice, that's just annoying biology. Then heart rate variability became the new personality test for half the conversation. I love that people now have morning scoreboards for their nervous system. The screenshot group chat energy there is elite, honestly. But the point was simple. If your HRV is low, stress, sleep loss, alcohol, and illness are all showing up. So it's not some random fitness vanity metric. It's basically a live read on how beat up your system is. And breathwork matters because it can raise that and calm panic attacks. Which is rude because the solution to panic is apparently just breathing correctly. The body really does hate dramatic people. Then alcohol got absolutely dragged, and honestly, fairly. The part where 1 or 2 drinks made his HRV look like illness was the real gut punch. Same response as stress, sickness, bad sleep, all of that at once. That's why it feels less like a drink and more like borrowing from tomorrow. And he wasn't even talking about alcoholism there. He was talking about casual drinking too, which is where people get defensive fast. Because nobody wants their Wednesday wine to become a moral issue. But the brain does not care about your vibe. The social pressure part was almost more interesting than the chemistry. Like the waiter bringing wine as if it's a personality test, not a menu choice. This is not alcohol, this is art, is actually insane behavior. The man really tried to out social pressure sobriety with one sentence. But that's the real point. Society keeps making drinking feel default. And if you say no, people act like you owe them a reason. That pressure is so normal it barely looks like pressure anymore. The bread and alcohol restaurant thing was also sneaky in a very depressing way. He's basically saying they're both there to loosen your frontal lobe and make you spend more. So the free bread is not charity, it's psychological warfare. Honestly, that should be printed on the basket. Then the obesity part got way darker than I expected. Because he's not just saying weight affects joints or appearance, he's saying it shrinks brain function too. And lowers blood flow, increases inflammation, stores toxins, all while society keeps shoving food at you. That war for the health of your brain line is not subtle. But it fits, because the manipulation around ultra-processed food is constant. The sugar history bit was nasty too. If companies can shift blame onto fat and quietly flood everything with sugar, that changes generations. People were basically handed a fake explanation and then blamed for the outcome. Then screens, which is the one everyone thinks they're managing better than they are. He says the reward centers get hammered by every notification until they get worn out. Which means doom scrolling is not just a bad habit, it's a pleasure system tax. I knew it was bad, but thrill them to death is a savage phrase. And the comparison part is almost worse than the dopamine part. Because the phone doesn't just stimulate you, it also tells you everyone else is winning. That is an exhausting way to live inside your own head. The happiness question was a nice landing, though. The idea that happiness shifts over life because striving changes makes sense to me. Like your problems don't disappear, but your relationship to them changes. And the reminder that happiness is a practice, not just a mood, felt useful. That night check-in, what went well today, is such a small thing, and somehow that's the point. It's almost offensively simple, which is usually how the good advice hides. I also liked the final arc of the conversation because it wasn't just self-optimization. It turned into responsibility, family, and what your state does to other people. That answer about happiness being a moral obligation was a strong ending. It makes your inner life feel less private and more consequential. And that's a heavier thought than be positive stuff. Overall, this episode really landed the same message from every angle. Your brain is not fixed, but it is sensitive, and the inputs matter. Sleep better, move more, drink less, stop letting screens and chaos drive the car. Which sounds boring until you realize it's basically the whole game. That's the series for now, and honestly, it leaves us with a lot to do. Thanks for riding through all 3 episodes with us, and we'll catch you next time. Welcome back. We're closing out the series with the stuff that actually changes the brain. Sleep, alcohol, screens, and the annoying truth that habits hit harder than opinions. And honestly, this is where the conversation gets personal fast. Because everybody wants a miracle until you ask about bedtime. That's the betrayal, right there. The sleep piece is wild because he frames it like cleaning your brain while you're out cold. The idea that the brain has a wash cycle is weirdly satisfying. It's like your head has a dishwasher and everybody ignored the button for years. And then he connects bad sleep to toxic buildup, memory risk, and worse recovery. Which is rude, because sleep already feels like the hardest habit to protect. Humanity looked at exhaustion and said, let's make it a lifestyle. But the sleep apnea part hit me harder than I expected. If you stop breathing at night, your brain is basically getting starved. And people can literally not know it because they sleep alone. That's such a brutal hidden problem. The scary part is how normal people dismiss the mask because it feels annoying. But if the trade-off is your brain, the mask starts looking less dramatic. Suddenly, a quiet machine wins the argument with your ego. Then the breathwork bit made it feel practical instead of preachy. 15 seconds, repeat it, and you can feel your system shift. That's the kind of tool people actually keep using. And it links straight into heart rate variability, which everybody now treats like a scoreboard. My feed has become a cult of little recovery numbers. The modern flex is waking up and being less broken than your friends. But I get it, because HRV is one of those metrics that makes invisible stress visible. If alcohol, bad sleep, stress, or sickness all crash it, that's a useful warning light. And the alcohol story is where he got very convincing. He stopped because one drink made his numbers look like a disease day. That is such a savage reason to quit. But it's also the most boringly powerful reason possible. Data. Alcohol gets exposed the second you stop romanticizing it. He's not talking about alcoholism first, he's talking about casual drinking as a brain tax. And that's where people get defensive, because they do not want the bill. They want the vibe and no invoice. Exactly, like let me have my little social poison in peace. But his point about white matter being affected even by small amounts is hard to shrug off. The brain highways matter, and he keeps saying that damage there changes behavior. Which is why the restaurant example was so good, even if it was annoyingly cynical. Bread, alcohol, smaller frontal lobes, bigger bill. A business model disguised as hospitality. And once he said bread, alcohol, and decision-making all hit the same control center, it clicked. Your impulse control is not just personality, it's brain state. That makes the alcohol conversation way bigger than nightlife. It affects marriage, parenting, work, even whether you say the wrong thing at dinner. Which is horrifying, because dinner is already a dangerous place. The screen time section felt like the same argument wearing a different outfit. Dopamine hits are fun until the pleasure system gets fried from overuse. We really turned the brain into a slot machine and called it productivity. The comparison trap is maybe the nastiest part. It's not just stimulation, it's self-hatred by repeated contrast. That is such a brutal way to describe scrolling. But accurate, unfortunately. And the stats he referenced on anxiety, depression, ADHD, and obesity are hard to ignore. If 3.5 hours is already a risk, most people are way past the edge. 3.5 hours is a warm-up for civilization now. Then there's the weight discussion, which he treated like brain health rather than appearance. That shift matters because it changes the shame into strategy. More weight, lower blood flow, more inflammation, more toxins, worse function. It's depressing how many systems get worse at once. And he's not even pretending the food environment is neutral. The manipulation piece is probably why people get so emotional about it. Because nobody likes being told the cheeseburger ad is basically a brain trick, or that the entire culture is engineered to make restraint expensive. The sex and hormones section was another one where he kept dragging it back to the brain. He's basically saying libido is not just chemistry in the abstract. It's blood flow, stress, trauma, hormones, and decision-making all stacked together. So romance is apparently a neurobiology group project. Nobody asked for homework, but here we are. I did like that he pushed against the idea that attraction is one size fits all. Different brains need different approaches, and direct pressure can backfire. The guy basically taught seduction through patience and serotonin. Also, the gender differences point was powerful without pretending men and women are identical. He's arguing biology matters, especially with frontal lobe function and emotional regulation. And the addiction and suicide patterns make the stakes real, not theoretical. That part always gets heavy because it's one of those places where silence kills. Exercise was the least glamorous answer, and maybe the most convincing one. Walk more, move more, sweat more, protect the brain by improving blood flow. Even cold plunges made sense in his world because they changed dopamine and mood. But he was careful enough to say not for everybody, which I appreciated. That's the difference between a fad and an actual framework. Although the fanatics will still turn it into a personality. The happiness arc at the end felt like the softer landing. He's basically saying contentment grows when striving eases. But he didn't pretend that age automatically fixes anything. He tied it to habits, gratitude, and how you train your attention. That's the recurring theme of the whole series, really. The brain changes, but only if your inputs change too. And that is both annoying and empowering. Annoying because it's work, empowering because it's work. I also loved how he turned knowledge into scheduling. Because that's the real gap for most people, not understanding, but execution. We are all very educated and extremely unserious. That should be stitched on a pillow. The final question about changing his mind was a strong note to end on. Happiness as a moral obligation is a wild idea if you grew up around shame. It makes self-work feel less selfish and more relational. That's probably the deepest thing he said across all 3 episodes. If your state leaks into everyone around you, then maintenance is love, which is a very inconveniently beautiful idea. And that feels like the right place to leave this series. If people take one thing from all 3 episodes, let it be this. Brain health is everyday life. Not someday, not after a breakdown, but now in the boring little choices. Thanks for staying with us through the whole run, and we'll catch you next time. Welcome back. This one is all about the daily stuff that quietly rewires your brain. Sleep, alcohol, screens, and the annoying truth that habits are not small. And I think the wild part is how measurable all of it is now. Like, this is not vibes anymore. This is brain chemistry with receipts, which is both comforting and deeply humiliating. Because sleep was the first big one, and he made it sound almost sacred. The brain basically gets washed when you sleep, which is such a ridiculous sentence. It sounds like a luxury spa for your neurons. But the glymphatic system opening at night is actually the whole point. And if you keep pretending 4 hours is enough, you are just storing junk. I love how many of us walk around like sleep is optional. Then we act surprised when our mood and memory look like they got hit by a truck. The sleep apnea part was even more brutal because that was framed as brain starvation. Not metaphorically, literally oxygen deprivation. And he said it can resemble an Alzheimer's pattern on scans. That is a terrifying sentence to hear about snoring. The body really said, congratulations, your hobby is slowly damaging you. The breathwork piece was interesting because it sounded almost too simple. 8 in, hold, 4 out, hold, repeated, and it can break a panic attack. That kind of thing feels tiny until you realize tiny is the point. And then heart rate variability becomes this weird scoreboard for your nervous system. The fact that you and your friends are screenshotting HRV every morning is so funny. That is the most modern male competition imaginable. But I get it, because if you can measure it, it becomes real. And the bigger idea was that higher variability means better flexibility and resilience. Which makes sense because depression, anxiety, and heart disease all get tangled together. That link between brain health and heart health kept coming up again and again. It is never just one system, is it? Your brain is basically gossiping with your heart all day. And alcohol was where he got absolutely ruthless. He basically said even a little bit damages the brain. Especially the white matter, which is the communication highway. So the drink is not just relaxing you, it is also kneecapping the roads. That is such a brutal way to describe a glass of wine. But the point was strong because he actually used his own data. He saw the same heart rate response from alcohol as from sickness or terrible sleep. And once that comparison exists, it becomes hard to unsee, especially when your sober data is so good that alcohol looks like sabotage. What I liked was that he did not frame it as only addiction. He was talking about the fence sitters, the social drinkers, the default yes people. That is the uncomfortable audience because they do not feel sick enough to change. Yet the argument is that the cost is already there, just quieter. And the restaurant story was hilarious and horrifying at the same time. The waiter putting wine beside him like it was a museum piece was insane. This is not alcohol. This is art is one of the most ridiculous lines ever. But it also shows how aggressively society nudges people to drink. Bread, alcohol, dessert, all of it is basically behavior design. He was saying restaurants want your frontal lobe a little softer, which is rude, honestly. A little frontal lobe theft with every reservation. The screen time part hit hard, because that one is so normalized. He described the pleasure centers getting worn out by constant little dopamine hits. Notifications, likes, scrolling, all of it adds up. 3.5 hours a day already increases anxiety, depression, addiction, obesity, and ADHD. And the real insult is the comparison trap on top of it. You do not just get overstimulated, you start feeling inferior. That is a nasty little combo. The obesity section tied all of it together in a very bleak way. More weight means less blood flow, more inflammation, and more toxin storage. And he was really saying brain size and function can go down as weight goes up. That is a huge claim, but he kept anchoring it to imaging and blood flow. The part about the food environment was maybe the angriest he got. He clearly sees processed food marketing as manipulation, not neutral commerce. Which is fair, because giant portions are basically a prank at this point. The Cheesecake Factory example was doing a lot of work. Then screens, alcohol, and food all pointed back to impulse control. That frontal lobe idea kept showing up as the thing that gets chipped away. And sex was interesting because he made it a brain conversation, not a romance conversation. Blood flow, hormones, trauma, forethought, all of that matters. The biggest sex organ is the brain, which is both true and extremely annoying. Because suddenly every bad mood becomes foreplay sabotage. His point about different brains between men and women was also very direct. More frontal lobe function in women, more limbic activity in women, more impulse issues in men. And then he connected that to everything from jail statistics to caregiving. You could tell he believes biology is not a social inconvenience, it is a real variable. People hate that because it resists tidy slogans. But the data he cited made it hard to just wave away. And I actually liked the happiness ending because it gave the whole thing a philosophy. He was saying happiness is a practice, not a mood lottery. That morning question, what went well, sounded simple but powerful. It turns out a lot of his advice is basically small repeats that compound. Sleep, breathwork, gratitude, movement, less alcohol, less screen overload. Not glamorous, but also kind of devastatingly effective. And I love that the final takeaway is agency. Not everything is fixed, not everything is fate, and the scan is not the sentence. You can change behavior, and that changes the brain. That is the whole gift of the conversation, honestly. And that feels like the right note to end this series on. Because the point was never to become perfect, just harder to wreck. A very low bar, but a noble one. If people are leaving with one practical move, let it be protect your sleep. And maybe stop letting every social ritual bully you into bad choices. Thanks for riding through all 3 episodes with us. We will see you in the next one. Welcome back. This is the last stop, and we're in the practical stuff now. Sleep, alcohol, screens, and the annoying truth that your brain is changeable. Which is great news until you realize your habits are the problem. The sleep part hit me hardest, because I used to romanticize being tired. Such a heroic flex, running on 4 hours and vibes. Exactly, and then the brain is basically taking a slow bullet. What I loved is the idea that sleep literally clears waste out of the brain. The fact that it has to do that only when you're asleep is wild. So the guy bragging about short sleep is bragging about keeping trash in his head. That is such a brutal sentence, but yes. And sleep apnea being linked to Alzheimer's is not a cute little warning. It's one of those things people hear and still go, "I'll deal with it later." The oxygen point was the thing that felt most undeniable. Starving the brain of oxygen sounds like a very bad lifestyle design. A terrible app update for the human body. And then the breathwork piece is so simple it almost feels offensive. We love a solution that looks too easy to be real. But the 15-second breathing pattern is actually insanely useful, especially if it can interrupt a panic spiral before it snowballs. Then heart rate variability became the new scoreboard. Humans will turn anything into a competition if you let them. My favorite detail was the group chat bragging about HRV like it's fantasy football. And honestly, that measurement obsession can be useful if it changes behavior. Because the point is not the number, it's the pattern under the number, which is why alcohol got exposed so fast. One drink and your body can look like it got hit by illness or stress. That comparison is what makes casual drinking harder to defend. Not impossible, just less charming than people pretend. The wine list as a social weapon is honestly hilarious and depressing. And the waiter treating refusal like a moral failure is peak restaurant behavior. That whole thing around social pressure was bigger than I expected. It's not just addiction, it's culture nudging people into default choices. Exactly, and that's why the "a little bit is harmless" story matters so much. Because a lot of people are not in crisis, they're just drifting. That's the dangerous middle zone. Then screens came in, and honestly, that part felt almost more sinister. Worn-out pleasure centers is a horrifying phrase. Your phone is basically a tiny dopamine car accident machine. That should be the product slogan and the lawsuit. The comparison trap is the real poison, though. It doesn't just distract you, it makes your own life feel smaller. And then people wonder why teenage anxiety keeps exploding. The happiest part of that whole conversation for me was the agency. Not all of it, obviously, but enough of it. Sleep better, move more, breathe on purpose, drink less, and stop doom scrolling like it's a personality. That last one was for me and half the planet. The weight piece was another gut punch, because it tied everything together. Lower blood flow, more inflammation, more toxins, less function, that's the spiral. And then the environment keeps pushing food like it's harmless entertainment. Cheesecake the size of a small boat is somehow a normal menu item. America really looked at portions and said, let's go bigger and sadder. But the useful part is that the brain is not fixed. That was the whole point of the series for me. You are not stuck with every bad pattern you inherited or built. You can train the thing, protect it, and actually get some leverage back, which is a much better story than doom. And that brings us to the last question. What changed your mind? I love that he landed on happiness as a moral obligation. That was unexpectedly deep without getting fluffy. Because how you feel leaks into everyone around you. That makes self-care less selfish and more responsible. And honestly, that's a pretty beautiful place to end. If people only keep one thing, let it be this. Pick 2 habits and schedule them. If it's not in the calendar, your life will eat it alive. Brutal but true. Thanks for being with us through all 3 episodes. We'll see you in the next one.